I want you to imagine something absolutely insane. Picture this. You're standing on a battlefield, the sun is beating down on you, sweat is pouring down your face, and you look across the field and see not hundreds, not thousands, but 15,000 enemy soldiers marching toward you. The ground is shaking beneath your feet from their footsteps. The air is thick with dust and the sound of war drums. Now here's the kicker. You and your fellow soldiers, you don't have 15,000 men. You don't even have half that. But you're not running. You're not retreating. In fact, you're about to write one of the most incredible pages in military history. This actually happened. And today I'm going to tell you about a battle so extraordinary, so against all odds, that when you hear the full story, you'll understand why historians still study it centuries later. Before we dive into the chaos of this incredible battle, I need you to understand something about warfare in the ancient world. When two armies met on the battlefield, there were certain expectations, certain rules that everyone understood. If you were outnumbered 3-1, maybe 4-1, you retreated. You lived to fight another day. That wasn't cowardice, that was common sense. Armies that stayed and fought, when hopelessly outnumbered, didn't just lose, they got annihilated. They ceased to exist. So when I tell you about an army that faced odds far worse than that, and not only stayed but won, you need to understand just how crazy that really was. The battle I'm talking about today took place in the year 480 BC, and it's known as the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, you might have heard of this battle before. Maybe you've seen the movie 300, which dramatized these events. But here's the thing. The real story is actually more incredible than any Hollywood adaptation could ever be, because what really happened at Thermopylae wasn't just about 300 Spartans. It was about strategy, sacrifice, geography, and a group of men who understood that sometimes holding a position isn't about winning, it's about buying time and making the enemy pay for every single inch of ground. Let me set the stage for you. The Persian Empire under King Xerxes was the superpower of the ancient world. We're talking about an empire that stretched from India to Egypt, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Xerxes commanded resources that would make any modern nation jealous. And in 480 BC, he decided it was time to finish what his father Darius had started, the complete conquest of Greece. Now, Darius had tried this before and failed at the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier, but Xerxes wasn't making the same mistakes. He was bringing everything. Ancient sources claim he had over 1 million men, and while modern historians think that's probably an exaggeration, even conservative estimates put his force at somewhere between 100 and 300,000 soldiers. Either way, it was the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. The Greeks knew they were in trouble. The various city-states of Greece, they weren't exactly best friends. In fact, they spent most of their time fighting each other. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states, had a rivalry that made modern sports feuds look like friendly disagreements. But when news came that Xerxes was crossing the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, with an army so large it reportedly took 7 days and 7 nights just to cross, the Greeks realized they had to work together or they'd be conquered one by one. Here's where the geography becomes crucial, and this is something the movie doesn't really explain well. Greece is a mountainous country. It's not like you can just march a massive army wherever you want. There are only certain routes an army can take, especially an army as large as Xerxes. The Greeks knew this, and they knew that if they could find the right spot, a place where the terrain worked in their favor, they might be able to slow down or even stop this seemingly unstoppable force. That's when someone looked at the map and pointed to a place called Thermopylae. Thermopylae, which literally means hot gates because of the hot springs in the area, was a narrow coastal passage between the mountains and the sea. At its narrowest point, this pass was only about 50 feet wide. Think about that for a second. Xerxes has this massive army, hundreds of thousands of men, but to get through Greece, to reach Athens and the other city-states, they had to go through this tiny bottleneck. It was perfect. In that narrow space, numbers wouldn't matter as much. You couldn't bring 100,000 men to bear against an enemy when only a few dozen could fight side by side at any given time. The Greek city-states met and debated what to do. Some wanted to fall back to the isthmus of Corinth and defend there. Others argued for meeting the Persians further north. King Leonidas of Sparta stood up and made his case for Thermopylae. He understood something that great military leaders throughout history have understood. Sometimes you don't need to destroy an enemy army to defeat them. Sometimes you just need to make them bleed enough that continuing isn't worth the cost. Sometimes you need to buy time. Now here's something most people don't realize about this battle. Leonidas didn't take just 300 Spartans to Thermopylae. That's the myth that's been popularized, and yeah, there were 300 Spartan warriors, but there were also about 7,000 other Greek soldiers from various city-states. Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Locrians, and others all sent troops. So why does history remember the 300 Spartans? Well, we'll get to that, because what happened at the end of this battle is what really cements it in legend. Leonidas arrived at Thermopylae and immediately understood the defensive possibilities. The pass was even better than he'd hoped. There was an old Phocian wall there, partially ruined, and he had his men rebuild and strengthen it. Behind this wall, in that narrow pass, he positioned his troops. The Spartans, these were professional warriors. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and put into the agoge, a brutal training program that turned them into the finest infantry soldiers in the ancient world. They trained every day for war. They lived for war. And they knew that in tight formation, with their bronze armor, large shields and long spears, they were virtually unbeatable. When Xerxes arrived and saw the Greek force, ancient sources say he couldn't believe it. He sent scouts to observe, and they reported back something strange. The Spartans were outside the wall, exercising and combing their long hair. Xerxes had a Greek advisor named Demaratus, actually a former Spartan king who'd been exiled, and when Xerxes told him what the scouts had seen and laughed about it, Demaratus didn't laugh. He explained that the Spartans were preparing for battle, and that combing their hair was something they did before they fought to the death. He warned Xerxes that these men would not surrender, that they would fight with a ferocity he'd never encountered. Xerxes didn't believe him. How could he? He had the largest army ever assembled. These Greeks had maybe 7,000 men. He sent a message to Leonidas, "Surrender your weapons." And Leonidas sent back one of the most badass replies in military history. 2 words in Greek, molon labe, come and take them. This phrase has echoed through history ever since. It's been used by freedom fighters, by soldiers, by anyone facing overwhelming odds who refuses to back down. Come and take them. It's a challenge, a declaration that if you want something from me, you're going to have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. Xerxes was insulted, but he was also confident. He waited 4 days, probably thinking the Greeks would see sense and retreat when they saw the full size of his army. When they didn't, he ordered an attack. This is where things get interesting, because what happened next defied everything Xerxes expected. He sent in the Medes and the Scythians, first thousands of them, expecting to overwhelm the Greek position through sheer numbers. These troops rushed the narrow pass, and they ran straight into the Greek phalanx. Now, if you do not know what a phalanx is, imagine a wall of bronze shields, each one 3 feet wide, overlapping. Behind those shields are men in full armor, and protruding from that wall are 8-foot-long spears, all at chest height. The phalanx moves as one unit, like a single organism. When it works correctly, it's almost impossible to break through. The Persians wore lighter armor, carried smaller shields and used shorter spears. When they hit the Greek line, it was like waves crashing against a cliff. They pushed, they fought, they died in droves, and the Greeks didn't budge. Xerxes watched this from his throne, and according to Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled these events, Xerxes jumped up from his throne 3 times in fear for his army. The Medes and Scythians were being slaughtered. The pass was so narrow that the Persian numbers meant nothing. They couldn't outflank, the Greeks couldn't surround them, couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. Worse, the Greeks were rotating fresh troops to the front, while the Persians were exhausted from fighting and from trying to climb over their own dead. After hours of this, the Medes and Scythians retreated in disorder. Xerxes was furious. He sent in the Immortals. These were his elite troops, called Immortals because their unit always maintained exactly 10,000 men. When one fell, he was immediately replaced, so the unit was, in theory, immortal. These were the best soldiers Persia had. Surely they would break through. They rushed into the pass, confident in their abilities, and they met the same fate as the Medes. The Greek phalanx held, bodies piled up in the narrow space. The Immortals, who had never known defeat, were being cut down like wheat before a scythe. Here's something that made the Greek defense even more effective. Leonidas had studied warfare his entire life. He knew that in a long battle, fatigue becomes your enemy. So the Greeks developed a tactic. They would appear to retreat, falling back in formation, and the Persians, thinking they were finally breaking through, would rush forward in disorder. Then the Greeks would turn, reform their lines, and attack the now disorganized Persian troops. It was brilliant. The Persians would lose all cohesion chasing what they thought was a retreating enemy, and then they'd be caught and massacred. The first day of battle ended with thousands of Persian dead and the Greek line unbroken. Xerxes must have been in shock. His vast army, his elite troops, everything he'd thrown at this tiny Greek force had failed. The second day he tried again. Different tactics, different troops, same result. The pass was becoming choked with bodies. The smell must have been unbearable. Blood ran in streams. And still the Greeks held. Now Xerxes was in a difficult position. He couldn't just go around Thermopylae by sea because the Greek navy was blocking the straits nearby. He couldn't retreat. That would be humiliating, and would show weakness to the other peoples of his empire. He had to break through, but how? His army was dying by the thousands, and hadn't gained an inch of ground. This is where treachery enters our story, because unfortunately for the Greeks, there was another path. A local Greek man named Ephialtes approached the Persians. His name would become synonymous with betrayal in Greek culture, used even today to mean nightmare. Ephialtes told the Persians about a mountain path, the Anopaea path, that went around the Greek position. It was a difficult route, not suitable for a large army, but for a few thousand men, it was passable. They could use it to come down behind the Greek lines and attack from both sides. Xerxes immediately sent his Immortals, led by Ephialtes, up this mountain path during the night. The Greeks had anticipated this possibility. Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the path to guard it. But here's where things went wrong. The Phocians were citizen soldiers, not professionals like the Spartans. When the Immortals approached in the pre-dawn hours, the Phocians heard them but assumed they were fellow Greeks. By the time they realized these were Persian troops, the Immortals were nearly upon them. The Phocians retreated to higher ground to make a stand, but the Immortals didn't waste time fighting them. Their mission was to get behind the Greek lines at Thermopylae, so they just marched past the Phocians and continued down the path. Greek scouts spotted the Immortals and ran to warn Leonidas. It was still dark, early morning of the third day. Leonidas called a council of war. The situation was clear. By midday, maybe sooner, the Persians would be behind them, the Greek position would be surrounded, the advantage of the narrow pass would be gone. Some of the Greek commanders argued they should all retreat immediately while they still could. They'd held for 2 days, killed thousands of Persians, they'd done enough. But Leonidas saw things differently. If all 7,000 Greeks retreated, the Persians would pursue them and probably destroy them in the open. But more importantly, if they all retreated now, the Persian army would pour through the pass unimpeded and would reach Athens within days. Athens wouldn't have time to evacuate. The Greek fleet wouldn't have time to prepare. Everything would be lost. But if some of them stayed, if they held the Persians here for just a few more hours, it might give Athens the time they needed. It might give Greece a chance. Leonidas made a decision. He ordered most of the Greek army to retreat. The Spartans would stay. The Thespians, showing incredible courage, refused to leave and stayed with the Spartans. The Thebans also remained, though ancient sources suggest they may have been forced to stay against their will. In total, about 1,400 men stayed behind, knowing they were staying to die. There's a moment here that's recorded in history that gives me chills every time I think about it. Before the last stand, Leonidas and his men knew they weren't going to survive the day. One of the Spartans, a man named Leonidas, was told that when the Persians fired their arrows, there would be so many that they would block out the sun. His response? Good, then we'll fight in the shade. This wasn't bravado. This was the mentality of men who had accepted death and were now focused solely on making their deaths count for something. On that third morning, Leonidas led his remaining forces out from behind the wall. They weren't going to defend from a fortified position anymore. They were going on the offensive. They pushed into the wider part of the pass, attacking the Persians with a ferocity that must have been terrifying to witness. The Spartans and Thespians fought like men possessed. They knew they were going to die, so they fought without any concern for their own safety. They only cared about killing as many Persians as possible before they fell. The Greeks pushed the Persians back initially, driving deep into their lines. Xerxes sent wave after wave of troops, and they died in heaps. The fighting was so intense that spears were breaking. Greek soldiers picked up Persian weapons and kept fighting. Others fought with swords, and when swords broke, they fought with daggers, and when they lost their daggers, ancient sources say they fought with their hands and teeth. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers died in this fighting, killed by the Greeks. Then the immortals who had taken the mountain path arrived behind the Greek position. Leonidas was now surrounded. He pulled his men back to a small hill in the pass. They formed a circle, shields facing out in all directions. The Persians surrounded them, and, unwilling to face these warriors in close combat any more, stood back and shot arrows. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky, just as that Persian scout had claimed. The Spartans and Thespians fought on, even as arrows found gaps in their armor, even as their brothers fell around them. Leonidas died in this final stand. The Spartans fought over his body, driving back the Persians 4 times to keep them from desecrating their king's corpse. But eventually the numbers told. One by one the Greeks fell. They fought until they literally couldn't fight anymore, until every single one of them was dead. Not one surrendered, not one begged for mercy. They died on their feet with weapons in their hands, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies. When it was over, when the last Greek had fallen, Xerxes walked among the dead. He was so enraged, so humiliated by the resistance these men had offered, that he ordered Leonidas's head cut off and placed on a spike. This was unusual for Xerxes, who usually treated enemy dead with respect, but the Spartans had made him look weak. They'd held his massive army for 3 days. They'd killed estimates range from 7,000 to 20,000 of his men. For 3 days, the largest army the world had ever seen couldn't advance more than a few hundred yards against a force less than 1/10 its size. But here's the thing, and this is what makes this battle so significant. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans didn't die in vain. Their sacrifice bought Athens the time it needed, the city evacuated. The Greek fleet had time to position itself at Salamis. When Xerxes finally broke through and marched on Athens, he found an empty city. The population had fled to the ships. The Greeks then defeated the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis, and without naval support, Xerxes had to retreat with much of his army. The invasion of Greece ultimately failed. Think about that for a moment. If Leonidas had retreated on that 3rd day when he learned about the mountain path, Athens wouldn't have evacuated in time. The Persian fleet wouldn't have been drawn into the narrow straits at Salamis, where Greek tactics could overcome Persian numbers. The entire history of Western civilization might have been different. There might not have been a golden age of Athens. Democracy might have died before it really began. Philosophy, theater, art, science, All the things we associate with ancient Greece might never have flourished. It's not an exaggeration to say that Western civilization as we know it exists partly because 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians decided to stay on a hill and fight to the death. The Greeks never forgot the sacrifice at Thermopylae. They erected a monument there, a stone lion for Leonidas and his Spartans. There was an epitaph written by the poet Simonides that was inscribed there. Translated into English, it reads, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." It's simple, dignified, and it captures the essence of what happened there. These men didn't die seeking glory or fame. They died doing their duty, following the laws and customs of their people, which demanded that they never retreat and never surrender. The battle had another effect too. It unified the Greeks like nothing else could have. After Thermopylae, the Greek city-states, who had spent centuries fighting each other, came together in a way they never had before. They'd seen what 300 Spartans could do. They'd seen men willingly die for Greece, not for Athens or Sparta or Thebes, but for all of Greece. It inspired them. At the battles of Salamis and Plataea that followed, Greek unity and Greek courage defeated the Persians decisively, ending the invasion. The story of Thermopylae spread throughout the ancient world. It became the standard by which military courage was measured. When Roman soldiers centuries later faced impossible odds, their officers would remind them of Leonidas and his 300. When the Texans defended the Alamo against the Mexican army, they saw themselves as following in the footsteps of the Spartans at Thermopylae. Throughout history, when free people have faced tyranny, when small forces have stood against overwhelming odds, the story of Thermopylae has been there as inspiration. But I want you to understand something important about why this battle matters beyond just the inspiring story of courage. Thermopylae demonstrated something about warfare that's still relevant today. It showed that geography, tactics, and the quality of troops can sometimes matter more than numbers. Xerxes had the numbers, but Leonidas chose the battlefield. The narrow pass negated the Persian numerical advantage. The Greek heavy infantry was superior to the Persian light troops in close combat. The discipline of the Spartan phalanx beat the individual bravery of the Persian fighters. Military academies around the world still study Thermopylae because the lessons it teaches are timeless. Know your strengths and your enemy's weaknesses. Choose the terrain that favors your way of fighting. Morale and training can be worth more than numbers. Sometimes the strategic objective isn't to win but to delay, to make the enemy pay such a high price for victory that it's not worth it to them. These principles are as valid today as they were 2,500 years ago. There's also something profound about the Spartan mindset that's worth examining. We live in a world where we're often told that the individual is the most important thing, that we should always prioritize our own safety and happiness. The Spartans had a different view. They believed that the community, state, was more important than any individual life. Now, you can debate whether that's right or wrong, and certainly Spartan society had many aspects we would find abhorrent today, including slavery and the brutal treatment of children in training. But there's something in their willingness to sacrifice for the greater good that speaks to us. When Leonidas made the decision to stay at Thermopylae, he knew he was condemning himself and his men to death. But he also knew that their deaths would save countless other Greek lives. He valued the survival of Greek freedom and culture more than his own life. That's a kind of courage that's hard to comprehend in our modern world. We admire it, we make movies about it, but could we do it ourselves? Could you stay on that hill knowing you were going to die, knowing that retreat was possible but choosing death because it was the right thing to do for others? I think that's why the story of Thermopylae continues to resonate. It challenges us. It asks us what we would be willing to die for, if anything. It presents us with men who had something they believed in so strongly that death was preferable to betraying it. In Sparta's case, their laws said that a warrior never retreats, never surrenders. To do so was to dishonor not just yourself, but your family, your ancestors, everyone who had ever been Spartan. So when retreat was the logical choice, the smart choice, the choice that would have saved their lives, they couldn't do it. They chose to uphold their code, even though it meant certain death. Now, I'm not saying we should all adopt Spartan values. Again, their society had serious problems. But there's something to be said for having principles you're willing to stand for no matter the cost. In our world, we often compromise, we bend, we rationalize. The Spartans at Thermopylae remind us what it looks like when people absolutely refuse to bend, when they draw a line and say this far and no further. The other aspect of this battle that's fascinating is how it demonstrates the power of a well-trained, professional military force. The Spartans trained for war from childhood. They practiced formations, they drilled with their weapons, they built up the physical strength and endurance needed to fight in heavy armor for hours. When they met the Persians, who were mostly conscripts from various parts of the empire with different levels of training and equipment, the difference was stark. The Persians had brave men, no doubt, but bravery alone wasn't enough against the disciplined precision of the Spartan phalanx. This is a lesson that's been learned and relearned throughout military history. A small, well-trained force can defeat a much larger, poorly trained force if the circumstances are right. The Romans built an empire on this principle. Their legions weren't always the biggest armies on the battlefield, but they were the best trained and most disciplined, and that won them battles again and again. The same was true of the Mongols, whose smaller but incredibly skilled cavalry forces conquered much of the known world. Quality over quantity is a cliché, but Thermopylae is a perfect example of why it became a cliché in the first place. Let's also talk about leadership for a moment. Leonidas was a king, but at Thermopylae he wasn't sitting on a throne watching the battle from a distance like Xerxes was. He was in the front lines. He fought alongside his men. He died with them. That kind of leadership, leading from the front, sharing the dangers and hardships of your men, inspires a loyalty that no amount of money or threats can buy. The Spartans followed Leonidas into what they knew was certain death because he had earned their absolute trust and respect. Compare that to Xerxes. He had to use threats and promises of reward to get his troops to attack. When the fighting got tough, he was far from danger, watching from his throne. The contrast in leadership styles is striking. One produced men willing to die for their cause, the other produced men who fought because they had to. Which do you think is more effective in the long run? History gave us the answer at Thermopylae. There's a postscript to this story that's worth mentioning. About a year after Thermopylae, the Greeks decisively defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. In that battle, a force of Spartan warriors was fighting, and they heard that some Persians were fortifying a position. The Spartans immediately charged this position, fighting with reckless bravery. The Athenians, who were fighting alongside them, were shocked at how the Spartans seemed to have no regard for their own safety. Later, when asked about it, the Spartans explained that they were fighting to avenge their king and their brothers who had fallen at Thermopylae. The memory of Leonidas and the 300 drove them to extraordinary feats of courage. That's the kind of legacy a true leader leaves. When we look at Thermopylae from a purely military standpoint, some might argue it was a defeat. After all, the Greeks lost. Every one who stayed died. The Persians broke through. But that's a superficial reading of what happened. Militarily, Thermopylae was a strategic success for the Greeks. The goal wasn't to permanently stop the Persians at that pass. The goal was to delay them, to bleed them, to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare. By that measure, the battle was a complete success. The Persians lost thousands of men and 3 valuable days. The Greeks lost 1,400 men but saved their civilization. This gets at something important about how we measure success and failure. Sometimes what looks like a loss is actually a win. Sometimes retreat is victory, and standing your ground is defeat. It all depends on what you're actually trying to accomplish. Leonidas understood this. He wasn't trying to win a battle in the conventional sense. He was trying to save Greece, and the way to do that was to make Xerxes pay such a high price at Thermopylae that by the time he broke through, it was already too late for him to achieve his larger objectives. I want to take a moment to address something about how this story has been used over the years. Thermopylae has been invoked by many different groups for many different causes. Some have used it to glorify war and violence. Others have used it to justify nationalism or militarism. I think that's a misreading of what the battle represents. Yes, it's a story about war, but it's not a story that glorifies war. If you read the ancient accounts, the horror of what happened at Thermopylae is clear. Thousands of men died brutally. Blood soaked the ground. The pass was choked with corpses. It was hell on earth. What Thermopylae represents isn't the glory of war, but the necessity sometimes of fighting for what you believe in. The Greeks didn't want to fight the Persians. They would have been happy to be left alone. But when faced with conquest and the loss of their freedom, they chose to fight, and some of them chose to die so that others could live free. That's not glorifying war. That's recognizing that sometimes, even though war is terrible, even though it brings death and suffering, there are things worth fighting for. Freedom is worth fighting for. The right to determine your own destiny is worth fighting for. Those are the lessons of Thermopylae. As we come to the end of this story, I want you to think about what would have happened if Leonidas had made a different choice. What if he'd said, "You know what, this is crazy. We're all going to die here for nothing. Let's retreat with everyone else." The 300 Spartans and the Thespians would have lived. Leonidas would have gone home to his wife and seen his children grow up. But Athens would have fallen. The Persian fleet wouldn't have been defeated at Salamis. Greece would have been conquered. The trajectory of human history would have been completely different. One man's decision, made in a moment of crisis, echoed through millennia. That's the power of choice. That's the weight of leadership. Leonidas chose death for himself and his men, and in doing so he chose life and freedom for Western civilization. When people say one person can't change the world, they're wrong. One person, in the right place at the right time, making the right choice no matter how difficult, can change everything. The Battle of Thermopylae ended over 2,000 years ago, but its lessons are still relevant today. Stand for what you believe in. Choose your battles wisely, but when you choose to fight, commit completely. Leadership means sharing the risks, not just the rewards. Quality, training, and discipline can overcome numerical superiority, and sometimes losing the battle is how you win the war. These are truths that Leonidas and his 300 proved with their lives, and they're truths we can still learn from today. So the next time you face overwhelming odds, the next time everything seems impossible, remember a narrow pass in Greece where 300 men stood against 15,000 and made the world remember their names forever. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite that fear. Remember that one person, one group, one stand can matter more than anyone thinks possible. Remember Thermopylae. Remember the 300. Remember that when asked to surrender, the only answer worth giving is come and take them.